Now that we've got our flapping bird and our background, we want to start to get the bird interacting with us. So Flappy Bird has got a very simple control mechanism. Essentially, all you need to do is tap the screen and then the Flappy Bird will start flying around. So how do we get a tap to be detected? It's very straightforward. We do it in the render method and we look for gdx.input, and then you can see there's lots of possible options there. So you can even work with the accelerometer and other fancy bits and bobs. We want to look for just touched. So this will be called every time the screen is tapped. So for now, let's just log something saying that it's been tapped. When you're working with a GDX app, it's best to use the GDX app logging command. So we use gdx.app.log and then something like touched. Yep. There we go. So now we should find, of course, that we get something added to the logs every time we touch the screen. And what we actually want is for this bird to drop out of the sky, and then for when we tap the screen, for the bird to essentially be given a shove, as if something's hit it from underneath and it flies up and then continues its fall. So essentially we want to create a gravity system, which is actually surprisingly easy to create. Here we go. So let's get the logs showing, and then I'll tap the screen and there we go. You can see there it's definitely responding to that touch. Okay. So if we wanted to move the bird, let's set up gravity and then we'll set up our touch to interact with that. So for our gravity, we're going to need to know two things about this bird. We're going to need to know its position and its velocity or its speed. So let's set that up. So we'll create these as floats, and then I'm going to call the position bird y. Now the x coordinate of the bird is always going to be the same. That's the horizontal coordinate because it's always going to be in the center of the screen. It appears to be moving to the right, but it actually stays in the center of the screen all the time. So it's only the y or vertical position that will change. And I'll set that to 0 initially, but we don't want it to be 0 for long because we want it to be equal to where the bird starts. So that's going to be initially this position here. Now we could build this into the render method, but we only need to get the height once right at the beginning. So to make it more efficient, we'll do it in the create method. So it only happens once. So we want bird y to be set to gdx.graphics.getHeight and then birds.flapstate.getHeight divided by 2. And both these birds have the same height. The only difference between them is one has got the wings up and the other's got the wings down. So actually it doesn't matter which one we use. So just to make things a little clearer, I'm going to use birds 0 rather than birds flapstate. Okay, so now this will work as it stands in the same way as it has already. So let's set up our velocity, which is going to be how fast the bird is moving. And again, I'll set that initially to be 0. And then what we'll do is we'll increase the velocity each time the render loop is called. And then we'll increase or decrease the y, so the position of the bird, by the velocity. So this is going to increase the velocity each time the render loop is called, and it's going to decrease the bird's y coordinate by the velocity. So we're going to get this effect of gravity that as it falls, it's going to fall faster and faster. Now, one thing I'm going to do before we run that is, if this is how you run it, then the bird will likely drop off the bottom of the screen before you can do anything about it. So I'm going to create a variable that we'll need anyway. It's an integer called GameState. And this will just keep track of the state of the game. So initially we're going to obviously just have the bird hovering in the middle, as it is just there, until the user taps the screen, and then gravity will kick in. So for all of this, we need to check if GameState is not 0. So we're going to do all of the processing only if the game state is not 0. And then when the game is touched, the screen is touched, we're going to set game state equal to 1. Now, I'm actually going to just copy that, and we're going to have this in an else statement there, because we only need to do this particular check if the game state is 0. And most of the time, especially when there's lots going on, the game state is not going to be 0. So to save having to do that check every time, we'll put it inside an else statement here. And of course, when you're making a game, you do need to be fairly careful about system resources and do things as efficiently as possible. So we'll take reasonable steps to make our game efficient, even though our game isn't particularly resource heavy. Okay. So that will make game state equal to 1, which will then kick in with our velocity and our bird movement. And of course, we will need to just copy that part of the code into game state being 0, because we still want to see the background and the Flappy Bird either way. In fact, while that's compiling, I'll just change it so that we get that every time. So we don't have to have the code twice. There we go. So it's only this velocity which is changing everything. Actually, it makes more sense probably to put that at the end rather than at the beginning. Then it will do the recalculated locations depending on the velocity, etc. And we want the flap state calculations to happen either way as well. So there'll be a lot more code in this if game state is not 0 part, because this is going to be where we put our game logic and our tubes and everything else. But for now, it's pretty brief. Here we go. So let's tap, and there he goes. Fantastic. Now that was fine, but a little bit slower than I would have liked. So you can of course experiment with how you want this to work, but what I'm going to do is set another variable here called gravity. And because 1 seemed to be a little bit slow, I'm going to initially set it to be equal to 2. Actually, let's make it a float, because we're going to be using it to work with floats, and you might well want to have 1.5 if you want to get it just right. So instead of increasing velocity by 1, we'll increase it by gravity. Okay, so we'll see how that works. Now, the way we want our interaction to work is if the game state is not 0, so i.e. if we're playing the game, we want, when the user taps the screen, for the bird to receive essentially a shove upwards, which is the same thing as giving the bird a certain velocity. Now I've played around with this, and I think a velocity of -20 works quite well. But let's run it and take a look. So if we give the bird a velocity of -20, because we're subtracting the velocity each time, that will subtract a negative number, so it will add to the bird's height, and the bird will shoot up into the air. Now, a slight alteration as well. I think it makes just a little bit more sense, even though it will work in much the same way to adjust the bird's velocity and location just after the touch rather than before. So let's give it a try now. So tap once, there we go. And you can see you can now tap and the bird does indeed head upwards and then falls back down. So actually looking at that, maybe let's try something like 30 and see how that works. And one more alteration before we're done with our game controls is I found during development it's frustrating that the bird disappears off the bottom of the screen, and so it's difficult to test things. So what I'm going to do to avoid that is look at bird Y, and if bird Y is less than 0, or in fact let's do it the other way around, if bird Y is greater than 0, so this will stop the bird going off the bottom of the screen. It will stop also, however, our ability to shoot the bird up. So let's have a quick or velocity is less than 0. And then that will allow us to shoot the bird up either when we're in flying mode, so we're in above the bottom of the screen, or if we give it a tap. So essentially it will allow us to move the bird upwards wherever we like, but it will stop the bird moving downwards once it gets to the bottom of the screen, which just make our lives a lot easier when we're doing testing. We don't have to get in there and keep the bird at the top of the screen all the time. So here we go. Yep, I'm liking the way that that moves around now. And then let's see what happens. So the bottom of the screen, then the bird stops and we can still move the bird upwards. So believe me, that will make our life a lot easier when we're testing. Okay, so now we've created our interaction with our bird. We've actually got quite a long way already into game creation. Our next step is to bring in our tubes and start creating several of them and get them moving from right to left. And we'll do that in the next video.